Sandy Hook was built to be New York's last line of defense, an impenetrable fortress with guns and walls meant to outlast any enemy or storm. But today, the so-called fortress that never existed has almost vanished, erased not by battle, but by shifting sands, failed ambition, and a war that moved on without it. How did America's ultimate stronghold disappear so completely that even its ruins spark controversy and confusion? The answer begins where the land first dared to stand against the sea. Long before concrete bunkers or disappearing guns, the land at Sandy Hook was already fighting a battle of its own. The peninsula, a 6-mile finger of sand and gravel, rests on a foundation of ancient schist and gneiss, but its upper layers are nothing more than glacial drift, loose, porous, always shifting under the pressure of wind and tide. Each storm season, the shoreline moved. Each year, the ground beneath the surface twisted and settled in unpredictable ways. This was the terrain chosen in 1857 for one of the nation's grand coastal fortifications, a 5-bastion masonry stronghold designed by Captain Robert E. Lee of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Lee's plans called for thick granite walls and 2 tiers of cannon, a fortress meant to anchor New York Harbor's defense. But almost as soon as construction began, the site's instability became impossible to ignore. Army Corps soil reports from the era describe waterlogged sand that yielded under the weight of stone, and Lee's own correspondence records his frustration. The shifting foundation necessitates repeated adjustment in masonry works, and each storm season unearths prior labor. Work continued through the Civil War, but the problems only multiplied. Freeze-thaw cycles opened cracks in the walls. Tidal surges undercut the foundations. Engineers tried to compensate, but the land itself refused to cooperate. By the late 1860s, the unfinished fort was already showing signs of structural settlement. Army memos from the 1880s document standing water in casemates, uneven floors, and entire sections listing out of true. By 1885, the decision was made to abandon the project. Most of the masonry was systematically demolished, the stones salvaged for seawalls and other local projects. Only fragments of Lee's original vision remain, half buried in sand or recycled into later structures. The lesson was clear. On ground that moves with every tide, permanence is an illusion. When the next generation of military planners returned to Sandy Hook, they would choose concrete and earthworks, lighter, more adaptable, and they hoped, better suited to a landscape forever in motion. The Endicott Board's 1885 report changed everything for Sandy Hook. Instead of granite walls, engineers poured reinforced concrete and shaped earth into low, sprawling batteries. The new fortifications looked nothing like the old masonry castles. They were built to survive the next war, not the last one. Battery Arrowsmith, finished in 1909 at a cost of just over $63,000, stood out as a symbol of this new era. Its 3 8-inch model, 1888 guns, sat on Buffington Crozier disappearing carriages, mechanisms that allowed each weapon to rise, fire, and then drop safely out of sight for reloading. At rest, the guns hid behind thick concrete parapets. Only when crews cranked the carriages did the barrels appear above the walls. The whole system was designed to outsmart enemy gunners, reducing the time and target visible to ships in the bay. Construction was never simple. Records from 1907 show engineers scrambling to shore up foundations after heavy rains and high tides threatened the fresh concrete. Extra layers of armoring and drainage were added, pushing the final price higher than planned. But the batteries were finished, and the army filled them with ammunition, tools, and men. The Sandy Hook Proving Ground, running since 1874, buzzed with activity. Artillery tests, ordnance experiments, and technical reports that shaped the next generation of weapons. Families moved into new barracks and officer quarters. Soldiers drilled on parade grounds, children walked to school, and the post exchange became the heart of daily life. By the time World War II arrived, Fort Hancock had swelled to a population of nearly 7,000. The base operated like a small city, with its own hospital, power plant, railway spurs and docks. Newsletters from the era describe baseball games, dances, and the constant rhythm of duty rotations. Behind the scenes, gun crews trained in tight routines, raising and lowering the carriages, loading shells, and waiting for alarms that never sounded. The fortress was at its peak, a blend of cutting-edge technology and vibrant community, standing ready for a threat that never quite came. By the early 1920s, the Army's own records show a new reality settling over Sandy Hook. Battery Arrowsmith, once a showcase of disappearing gun technology, was designated for disarmament. The guns were hauled away for scrap, their carriages cut up and sold off, as documented in War Department accession logs from 1920. Official memos from the period reveal a growing consensus in Washington. Fixed coastal artillery could no longer keep pace with advances in warfare. Aircraft, submarines, and long-range naval guns made concrete emplacements vulnerable and increasingly irrelevant. Throughout the 1930s, more batteries slipped into caretaker status. Army engineers filed maintenance reports that read like eulogies, notes on leaking roofs, flooded magazines, and the slow encroachment of sand. Budgets for repairs shrank, and the once busy rail lines and ammunition trams fell silent. Internal debates within the War Department, preserved in correspondence from 1925 to 1935, show officers warning about the gaps in the seaward arc, but the momentum toward decommissioning was unstoppable. After World War II, the site found a brief new purpose. The Cold War brought a fresh wave of construction, but this time, the threat came from above. In 1954, Fort Hancock became home to Nike missile batteries, surface-to-air systems designed to intercept Soviet bombers. Army site records detail how old bunkers were repurposed as command posts and radar stations, while new missile silos and radar towers rose among the crumbling concrete of earlier defenses. The Nike Ajax, and later Nike Hercules, operated here until 1974, when the last missile crews packed up and the Army withdrew for good. The transformation was complete. What had started as a fortress of guns now stood silent, its original purpose erased by shifting technology and institutional priorities. The buildings remained, but their meaning was lost, leaving behind only locked doors, flooded passages, and the echo of decisions made far from the shifting sands of Sandy Hook. Salt air does more than stain concrete. At Fort Hancock, it seeps through every crack, carrying chloride ions deep into the walls and floors of abandoned batteries. Over time, salt crystallizes inside the pores, expanding with each tide and each winter freeze. Rebar buried in the concrete begins to rust, swelling and pushing outward until the surface spalls away in slabs. Engineers who study the site today measure corrosion rates as high as 0.5 millimeter per year, enough to undermine a gun platform in a single generation. Freeze-thaw cycles, sometimes as many as 40 in a season, drive water into fine fissures, then split them wide as ice forms. The original Endicott-era concrete, mixed on site with local sand and no modern air entrainment, was never made for this kind of punishment. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 brought the science of decay into sharp relief. Storm surge flooded Fort Hancock's historic district, inundating buildings 119 and 120, and leaving behind a brine that soaked deep into foundations. National Park Service reports from the months after Sandy record a spike in chloride levels and moisture readings in battery walls, along with new cracks and collapsed floors. Photos from those days show rusted rebar exposed to the air, sections of parapet broken loose, and entire rooms submerged in salt water. Today, the Park Service faces hard choices. Some batteries, like Potter, are stabilized and open for tours, their surfaces patched and monitored for new cracks. Battery Gunnison is under active restoration, a showcase for what stewardship can accomplish. But most structures remain off-limits, too unstable, too costly to repair. Rangers and preservation experts debate how much to intervene, knowing that every winter and every storm tips the balance further toward loss. The fortress is caught between memory and the elements, its fate as much a question of chemistry and climate as of history. At its peak during World War II, Fort Hancock supported a population of nearly 7,000 and housed some of the most advanced coastal defenses in the United States. Yet, as military technology changed, Battery Arrowsmith was disarmed by 1920, and most heavy guns were removed, with official War Department records documenting the systematic dismantling. Today, only fragments of these once massive structures remain. Environmental reports confirm that salt, storms, and shifting sands have further erased the fort's physical traces, with Hurricane Sandy in 2012 inflicting significant damage on surviving buildings. While some records, such as detailed construction blueprints, are preserved, the full operational routines and personal stories of everyday garrison life are only partially documented. The fate of Fort Hancock highlights how obsolescence, not disaster, can erase even the mightiest fortifications. What endures is not the fortress itself, but the evidence of its gradual disappearance, a reminder that the most formidable defenses can vanish quietly when their purpose ends.